Okay, now, one of the things I'm trying to do with this lecture is to really situate, and this is what the readings were there to do, is to situate this development discourse in a historical context. Development has a history. Development thinking has a history. And it's not a benign history. It's not a history that doesn't carry with it whole value sets of its own. And that also makes it difficult. So the start that I want to take now is not the post-development position, it's the more positive position of what I talk about in the title as, or allude to in the title as, making development. By making development, I mean, what is development? What do we mean by development? And I want to take some examples of definitions, and I want to try and put them into some kind of framework that helps us think a little bit more clearly about how we are defining development for ourselves. So what I'm going to talk about is positive and evaluative definitions of development, and then I'll give you some examples. We'll then talk a little bit about the critiques of development, and that will be quite a lot about the post-development McGregor positions and about where they've got to now, but we will also talk about what Redcliffe is complaining about in terms of sustainability. And lastly, and the last section very much has a question mark at the end. Lastly, I want to start to say, okay, so for you, what do you think we should be doing about this? And we all need to come up with answers for that, because there is something quite personal in working out where our value systems place us in terms of thinking about which of these or other definitions of development are most important, what order we do them in, what kinds of instruments we think are useful, and what kinds of issues or what kinds of ways we have of dealing with issues of inequality of delivery. So whose well-being is important and is it okay for some people to benefit more than others from whatever we're doing? So development's a really powerful set of ideas. Actually, it's a lot of sets of ideas. It's very poorly defined, and it's capable of working for, and I'm afraid this is true, for either liberation or domination. Development so defined sometimes actually supports the kind of systems that are in place, and you could argue, and I think I would argue, that it always supports power structures, because you can't have a society without power structures that will benefit some people more than others. So this relativity of asking who is okay to benefit at whose cost is really important. There's nothing trivial about it. I'm going to say in a moment, there are no win-win solutions in development, and unfortunately there aren't. Win-win solutions are solutions which simply leave out definition or analysis of who's losing. Now, there are circumstances where the people who lose can afford to lose, and we want to say, okay, that's fair enough. So taxing the mega wealthy, the mega wealthy lose, maybe that's okay because it allows us to create a more equal society. But don't call taxing the mega wealthy a win-win solution, because if you do, you will be surprised when you find that the mega wealthy resist. So actually what we need to be doing is much more pragmatically and realistically thinking about who is likely to object to whatever definition we're applying, and what are we going to do about it is important, and how we play the politics we need to play to be able to achieve the kinds of things we're aiming for. And those are not trivial or easy questions to answer. So, making development. I think you've already got, and maybe the DAT class will recognize my interest in definitions. Definitions kind of underpin so much of what we talk about. We use words very glibly. Development is an obvious one. So we talk about what's positive, what's good, what are we trying to achieve, what can we plan, what will help us to achieve something, but we don't necessarily in that process of conversing and thinking dig deeply enough into what we mean by those things. And each of those terms, development, planning, equality, justice, poverty, are actually not simple terms. Each of them has sets of contestation around them, different views, and so on. So definitions are important. Now I would divide definitions of development into two broad groups. In fact, what I'm going to use is a typology that Des Guster came up with, which I've played with a little bit, which is to say some definitions of development are positive. And by positive, I don't mean good. Positive in this sense is positive in the sense of positivist. And if you know the scientific term positivist, what you're talking about is the idea that there is an objective truth out there. And that what our job as researchers or academics is to try and learn that, to understand it. So it's something we're seeking. We're seeking to shed light on this objectivity out there. So in that sense, positive definitions of development are assuming that even if we have difficulty coming up with a definition of it, there is something that is good that we should be trying to achieve, that's somehow not normative, it's relatively neutral, and it's probably going to inform some kind of fundamental or structural change if we're talking about change. Development is change. And we can intervene to achieve that relatively easily because what we're aiming for is definable, even if it's complicated and we don't have the full picture. So, and I'll give you some examples of positive definitions of development in a minute. Evaluative, on the other hand, tend to be the ones that we use much more often, more openly, more consciously, more explicitly. Actually, we usually combine the two. So evaluative tend to be value-based, subjective. They tend to be these kinds of things. They're the kinds of things where we're saying we want an improvement, we want to achieve something good. We don't just want to achieve a structural transformation that somehow moves towards some objective truth out there. We're actually defining, we're defining the values that we think should be applied in the development process. So what we're seeking is improvement or reduction in poverty, etc. What it means is, and as I said, and I'll come back to this in a second, most of our definitions of development combine positive and evaluative elements. Most of them, not all. So positive elements might be industrialization, economic growth. These are transformations. We're assuming that the world is basically all built around some kind of objective truth, there's something out there, there's something we're trying to achieve. We don't quite know what it is. We're getting better and better at defining it. But somehow these processes of structural change, economic growth, modernization, urbanization, are an inevitable part of this process, and we can see that because they've become such a universal part of it in the past. So some of these are a bit more complicated. So we might talk about development, so we do talk about development as an industry. If we talk about development as an industry, we're assuming what we mean by development is something in which we are intervening. Now, if we say development is an industry which can lead to good or bad things, sometimes it gets it right, sometimes it gets it wrong, then that interpretation of development is development as professional intervention. It's the process of intervening which we are defining as development. We may talk about things like community mobilization, or in the next slide, under evaluative examples, I'm going to give the example of education. We could say that community mobilization is an end in itself. Someone did when I was asking what development was before. Is community mobilization an end in itself, or is it a process that's meant to lead to something else? Education is a bit the same. Some people would say education is an end in itself and we should be increasing literacy because it leads to people's sense of empowerment. Some people say no, we should be increasing literacy because it leads to a more productive society and it helps the economy to grow and we can all become richer. Those are two quite different things. You could say the same, they're not mutually exclusive, but they're different. And they have very different consequences. So, that's positive definitions. Evaluative definitions tend to be about an improvement, so well-being, happiness, choice. Choice is a favourite, what used to be a favourite for neoliberals, talking about what development is. Development is about the increase in choice available to everybody. And what they meant by choice was, you might be rich or you might be poor, but as long as if you can afford it, you can choose to do something, then that's okay. So that's an evaluative definition that is very consistent with a neoliberal process definition, or normative, or positive definition. Justice we've got there, human rights, equitable wealth distribution. So an element of justice would be reducing inequality. Income per capita, those are all end results, things that you would aim for by themselves. I mentioned before I was going to say education, but that might be both an end or a means. Good governance is sometimes put forward as an end in itself, or maybe that's a means to an end and part of a facilitative environment. What is true about all of these are they're all subjective. They're all value-based. So it's much harder to measure these ones than it is to measure the process ones. Okay, I'll give you some examples. So, a lot of you will have seen that definition before. You will have seen it if you did the readings. Can someone tell me what that comes from, that definition? What's WCED 1987? Yeah, Brundtland Report. So it's one of the really, really important, still influential definitions of development that came from the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987, that is still quoted quite a lot as a definition of what we mean by sustainable development. And it's got a lot of power because it's simple. Is it a process definition or an end in itself? Is it a positive or an evaluative one? Positive? Yeah, I think it's mostly positive. So what they're trying to achieve is something which is an end result, something that would be good in perpetuity. So, yep, that's value-based. How do you measure that? How do you know if you've achieved that? I mean, look, there's the problem. If it's an end result, sorry?
We could be aiming to move towards a more circular economy. You're putting back into the system as we're taking out of it. Jobs and homes and education is being provided at the same time, and things are just moving round and round. The inputs and outputs are the same, but we are definitely not in that position.
Yeah, so I would say you can measure it. The problem is you can only measure it in hindsight. So you can measure inputs and outputs, you can measure the way the economy is performing, you can measure whether or not you're creating environmental damage which is causing problems for future generations, but you can't do that until future generations. So that makes it very hard to set objectives that you can then plan towards. Doesn't make it impossible, but it has very serious consequences for, so what do we do? What do we do about this? What do we do to try and achieve this? Okay, that one tells us what kind of definition it is. Any diverse and multifaceted process of predominantly positive change in the quality of life for individuals and society in both material and non-material respects. So, it's got a combination of evaluative and positive positions, as have most definitions, but it's mostly on the process. It's mostly the idea that it's some process of change, which is mostly good, but then it's also a process of change which is sometimes bad by exclusion. So that's another very, very legitimate, serious attempt to define development, which is much more process. There's another one. So the objective is to expand what people are able to do and be, and to enable them to enjoy a long and healthy life, good education, a meaningful job, physical safety, and democratic debate. Now what's that? Is that mostly process, or is it mostly normative, mostly evaluative? Yeah. So there's quite clearly a shift there to trying to achieve something normative, something value-based, something which is hard to measure, something which is multifaceted. And the more multifaceted anything is, the harder it is to plan for. Because then you really do have questions about which ones of those things. Healthy life, good education, meaningful job, physical safety, democratic debate. Which one of those is most important? Which one do you go for first? Which ones would you sacrifice if you had a choice, if you were forced to make a choice? There's another one. Sorry, there's the reference. So another book which I find quite useful is by Peake and Hartwick, Richard Peake and Elaine Hartwick. They write very convincingly. It's a very nice book about that tries to unpick some of the things we're talking about now. And what they put forward is that maybe what we need is something which takes from the history of development, takes from the idea of what it is to go through stages, but updates that in a way that loses some of the baggage that comes with something like modernization theory. If anyone's studied development studies, you know what that is. Brings it into a more contemporary frame and addresses it as a critical issue, or takes a critical view of it, tries to dissect it and understand what it might mean in a more, in a contemporary environment. So Peake and Hartwick's definition is just to say the social use of economic progress. Development has quite a long history, pithy little definitions of itself. So another one that's very often quoted, I can't remember who first said it, is development is positive change. Or good change is another variation on that. You have to then define what you mean by good. But development also has a very long tradition of very, very long and involved definitions that try to tackle the complexities of what that process is and what the ends are. So, for example, a guy that was writing he's been a prominent development theorist for a long time, worked a lot on development management and the idea of development and how you plan for development, called Milton Esmond, came up with a definition in 1991 that read like that. And just take a couple of minutes to read it, because it's important. And he's really worked hard to pack a lot into that. It's not short, but every word counts. What do you reckon? Yeah.
On this point and the previous two, there's no reference at all to like environmental concerns, and that's like my background, my concerns. So, this is massively missing a huge area of concern for me.
Yeah. So, presumably you found more in the Redcliffe reading, and his point that development has been explicitly anthropocentric would ring true to you. This is an example. So that's one of the criticisms that Redcliffe makes. He's saying development has been focused on humans, people, without, not explicitly at the expense of the environment, but at the expense of the environment because it ignores it. So yeah, that's a really good point. Any other comments on that one? Yeah.
It really makes sure that the definition of development, even though it does come the notion of the Western world and what it is, it doesn't necessarily come with a cultural connotation, right? So the fact that it's not necessarily organization, it's understanding that yes, we're copying those metrics and those data forms, that we're not trying to establish our unique or way back.
Yeah. And pragmatically you could say fair enough, or pragmatically you could say actually no, that's a problem.
Yeah. I think there's a difficulty you will recognise improvement in the people condition. It sounds kind of obvious that one person's improvement might not be a Western improvement. So it's embedding it with other definitions. It's not quite as complete as you say. As it sits out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it may be in the state to even try and make it look complete because you will inevitably miss out things. So the environment's a big one. But there are a whole lot of other things missing there as well. He's also trying not to be uncontroversial. He's trying to sort of put a line in the sand for himself and say, you know what, I think it does mean secularization, industrialization, and urbanization. Not everyone agrees with that. So he's deliberately trying to be honest about his view. So he's giving something to argue about, which is good. But he's also opening himself to exactly the risks of a very detailed, comprehensive attempt to define development. So the response to that, and you would have got it from McGregor very clearly, a lot of that was about post-development. That's what post-development was saying. So post-development, Rist came up with, Gilbert Rist, his own definition of development. And he takes a definition of development which looks superficially exactly like any other definition of development in general terms. That we're talking about the transformation of social relations to improve well-being, except he inverts it. He very much takes into account environmental destruction as a part of the process of capitalist transformation. So the general transformation and destruction of the natural environment and of social relations in order to increase the production of commodities. He's deliberately making it sound like a development definition, but he's deliberately subverting it in a way that I think legitimately points to some of the problems with those definitions of development.
What's the problem with capitalism?
Problem with capitalism. So one of the definitions of development is capitalism.
Is that really aligned with what we definition of post-development. It's transforming itself from this angry critique that we could also see here to actually more research for opportunities. So what was written in the reading was actually that this whole angry establishment, this angry idea of development is not really accurate anymore. However, this was published in 2007.
So McGregor is not a post-development. He's not part of the post-development school. He's influenced by it. He's talking about it, but he's criticizing it as well. Some of the post-development people have gone on to write things that aim to be less angry. Some are still just as angry. So when he says that it's moved on and there's not so much angry critique in the same way as there was before, he's right. There's not so much, but there is still some. So I would say Gilbert Rist is still pretty pissed off with the whole process, the whole enterprise of development. And he's not scared to say it. I'm not sure what he would be saying in 2018. That is 11 years ago. So maybe he's changed his tune since then. A lot of post-development thinkers have, but not all. So it's not so much that it's 2007. I was trying to give a classic definition of post-development, or a post-development definition of development, I should say. There are many criticisms of it. We've already talked about quite a few of those mentioned in the process of the discussion we've had so far. So there are criticisms that it's externally imposed, top-down, westernizing, homogenizing. There are criticisms that it's all about technology. Now, that's interesting. If you read the Redcliffe reading, he also talks about technology in quite a different way, although opens questions. Lipton is not a post-development thinker. He's someone that was writing quite a long time ago about complaining that development was too urban-focused, so he pushed a lot the idea that rural poverty is worse than urban poverty, and therefore development should be focused on rural areas more than urban areas. So he wrote about urban bias. Now that's something that comes into the post-development critique in the sense that post-development critique sometimes refers to urban elites as capturing power centres, capturing the politics of development, and capturing therefore the consequences, the wealth created by different versions of development. Authoritarian or anti-democratic are broadly similar in the sense that what they're saying is it's top-down, that it's imposed on other countries. Risks definitely, so in the same article that I just quoted from before, you can see the importance he places there on environmental destruction and if you think of a classic Marxist critique of development, of capitalism I mean, it's a critique that says that there is a class of people who are able to extract from the factors of production because they own the means of production, the ability to take more than their share of the profits, the surplus that they get from those factors of production. One of the factors of production is natural resources, the environment. Another is labour. So the environment and social and society, that's why Rist is using those two examples as what is being plundered in order to enable an increase in the production of commodities. So what he's doing, Rist is doing in 2007, is making a fairly classical Marxist critique of capitalism, but applying that to development. So for him, development means capitalism, and he doesn't like it for that. Okay, now, so then the question that I ended with, and that I will end now with, there we go, not too bad, is, so how do we measure this thing? If development has all these potential meanings, and we don't agree what they are, and maybe we have composite definitions ourselves anyway, what is it that we need to measure? So, and headline figures often don't help that much. So one obvious one is mass poverty. Okay, there's a very well-established now set of metrics on what levels of mass poverty are, comparable over years, using mechanisms like purchasing power parity, and poverty lines that are adjusted so that we can compare 1990 with 2015, for example, and say that, fantastic, low-income countries, 43.9% of people in low-income countries living on less than $1.90 a day, that's an absolute poverty line, okay? And the good thing is that's down from 60.6% in 1990. Wonderful, we're doing really well. Or are we not doing so well because that's an increase from 303.2 million, that's an increase from 213 million to 303 million. So the number of people in absolute poverty is growing. Which is more important? Okay, maybe systemically the percentage is more important. Even so, the absolute number is not immaterial. Of course, that differs from region to region. The improvement in sub-Saharan Africa, no surprise really, has not been as significant as it has in low-income countries generally. There's an interesting quote here. If you look at the numbers carefully, you'll notice that in 1990, 213 people in sub-Saharan Africa, in low-income countries, were in absolute poverty, but 277 million in sub-Saharan Africa. How could that be? How could it be higher in sub-Saharan Africa than in low-income countries? Because not all sub-Saharan African countries were categorized as low-income? Maybe. I tried to do some research on how that figure came about, but I ran out of time to try and work it out. So it's an interesting, when you see data like that, you've got to wonder, what's going on there? Something's going on. There's something about the definition of low-income countries that's changed, or somehow something has to make sense of what that figure is. Maybe it's wrong. Okay, so that's one measure. It's one measure that in percentage terms looks good. It's an improvement. If you look at the numbers over the years, you will see that in the early 1990s, the percentage rate went up quite sharply. What was happening in the early 1990s that made the percentage rate go up? You don't need to answer that. Things were changing. Capitalism was changing, but there was a sharp increase in the percentage, not just the absolute number of poor people. It then started to decline again from 1993. So even looking behind those figures, there's a bit more complexity. There are also figures like food insecurity, which tell us kind of different things. Sub-Saharan African food insecurity has improved. That's a good thing, 23% down to 33%, although looking at two figures like that masks fluctuations from year to year. So that can be quite misleading. Similarly, with the undernourished figures there, 10.9% of the world population generally between 2014 and 16 is an improvement, but it's an improvement that masks a lot of serious fluctuations. Inequality shows different outcomes. Inequality is, by any measure, getting worse. Within countries, inequality is often highest in middle and high-income nations. And I'm going to show you a graphic from the OECD in just a minute of OECD countries, which is quite interesting. And that richest 1% own 40% of the global assets has worsened since 2008. Environmental depletion is also getting worse. Deforestation rate, though, has slowed, but that's the deforestation rate, so it's the net level at which forests are disappearing. So reducing the deforestation rate is good, but it's not enough. It doesn't mean that you're starting to see a reversal of the trend. The trend is still going, it's just slowing. Now, if you do have a finite resource, like forests, and you reduce that resource rapidly for a period, you will see the rate of that reduction slow as the resource gets smaller. So, in some ways, it might not even be good to see the rate slowing. It's probably just slowing too slowly. And literacy was the last one. Now, literacy, I put that in. There's an interesting book by Morton Jervin, which was out in 2015, looking at African data. And what he did very meticulously was he unpicked a lot of the key data that's presented on African growth and African development, and showed that actually a lot of it is wrong. And it's wrong because of misconceptions and misunderstandings about what we take that data to mean. So if you're interested in looking at data and the way data can be misused, do have a look at that book. It's really worth getting. It's not hard to read, but he is an economist and it uses lots of data. So if you're numeracy if you're not comfortable looking at the data, maybe that's a reason to get the book and read it, because it's a good idea to try and get comfortable with it. But it is really, really edifying in terms of looking at just how he argues, and I think correctly, data is misinterpreted. So the point there really is, so data never means exactly what it says. It doesn't speak for itself. We have to interpret it. And any headline data hides detail. That's the slide I was going to show you on inequality. So that's relative poverty. Now, in DAC the other day we were talking about what is development, and someone said, for me, development would be eradicating relative poverty. And we talked about whether that's possible. Okay, relative poverty is very different from absolute poverty. I talked before about the World Bank $1.90 a day level poverty line, that's absolute poverty. Now you can, conceivably, raise everyone from below $1.90 a day to above $1.90 a day as an income. Whether that's the ideal result or not is a slightly more complicated question, but it would presumably be a good thing, and it's something that you could conceive of achieving, even adjusted for inflation, purchasing power parity, or whatever. It would be harder to say you could eradicate relative poverty, because presumably to really say you've eradicated relative poverty, you will have a very, very equal society across the globe. Now, the definition here of relative poverty is that, or the definition of poverty here in the OECD data is poverty is that the percentage of a group of people that has less than 50% of the median income of the country in which they live. So less than half of the median, not median income of that country. What they've done is they've then analysed that for different social groups, age groups, and so on. So here you can see that the cross is older people, 66 and above, and the diamond there is younger people, under 17 years old. So what they've done is they've looked at the total population, and that's the main graph, and they've looked at how it is for older people and younger people, and they found quite different results. Some quite startling. Koreans here, I don't know whether it's a surprise or not, but there you have younger people much more equal, in other words, much better off compared to the average than older people. And that's the biggest distinction, the biggest division in any country. So what that's telling you is actually that relative rate is giving you some quite interesting information about the structure of inequality in given societies. And you can do a lot with that relative poverty rate. Now, to reduce that, to eliminate relative poverty, presumably you would have to try and get this down to as close to zero as possible. You would have, well, to eliminate, you have to get it to zero. And you'd have to then, even then, you'd have to argue, so that definition of no percentage of the population is living on less than half of the median income for that country, you've still got relative poverty in there, in the sense that some people will still be poorer than others. But if you're willing to accept that as a cut-off level, then you could say you've eliminated that. But then you've still got a judgment there on what it is you're trying to eliminate. So there's a lot of different information there. I've given you several bits of data which tell us different things. I've given you absolute numbers of poverty and of absolute poverty. I've given you ratios of absolute poverty, i.e. percentages. They tell us different things. The ratio is getting better, the absolute number is getting worse. I've given you relative poverty here. Relative poverty where you can start to dissect that between groups. Now this is the kind of data where you can start to say, okay, if we want to address something in a particular country, in terms of relative poverty, we might be able to think of ways of doing that. So maybe that's a little bit more useful. Okay, that's enough numbers. We don't have any Somalis this year, do we? Do we have any Somalis? Anyone speak Somali? No? Okay. So, one of the criticisms from post-development is that development is a westernizing thing. It's something which imposes values on people. And I was fascinated by this poster in Hargeisa, so I took a picture of it. It's interesting to me because it tells us quite a lot about the way development works, I think. So what that means is, is to educate girls to educate a nation. Okay, now that's really interesting. It's interesting on many, many levels. First of all, is educating girls the same as educating a nation? What does that mean? It sounds worthy. It sounds good. Sorry? Yeah. So there's something about what education, how much education, what level of education, what degree, what quality. There are a whole lot of implications for what we mean. There are also a whole lot of other really interesting things there. The fact that it's in Hargeisa, it's in Somaliland, a country that none of the rest of the world recognizes as exists. So which nation do they think they're educating by educating Somaliland girls? So they fudge that. It's also interesting, Look, which logos are on there? So who's educating girls in Somalia? The UK. What does that mean? I mean, is that... So, I mean, fine, maybe that's good. I'm not saying that's bad, but I am asking you, what do you make of that? What do you think Somalilanders make of that when they see that kind of thing? I mean, I'll tell you one thing that they think about it, and it's coming through as an increasingly vocal narrative, is this is just the West telling us what to do. And you can kind of see why people would think that. So that issue of post-development critique of development as something Western imposed, top-down, something imposed from outside, well, you can kind of see how that thinking comes about, can't you? Now, I'm certainly not saying that educating girls is a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. But we do have to be very conscious of what it is we're pushing when we're talking about development and education. And we all need to be conscious of that because we are all here in some way to try and talk about development as something where we can intervene in a way that is constructive. And intervening means coming, even if we're doing it in our own country, it means we're still outsiders to some degree. We're still coming and trying to do something to other people. So that creates quite an onus on us to try and work out what it is we're trying to do and why. Okay, pretty much I want to end there. I want to end though with a few questions about a response. So what you need to do, what we need to do, what I think I'm trying to do all the time is trying to work out, so what do we do about all this? If the data doesn't really tell us anything by itself, or what it tells us is complicated, if our definitions of development are so contested and difficult and complex and so on, if it's so hard to measure the outcomes that we might want to look towards, then what do? I'm drawing quite heavily here from Pete and Hartwig, but from another number of sources as well. I think that one of the things that's really important is that we develop the capacity to be really critical about what we're looking at. And that can be very simple things. It can be simply knowing when we look at a set of data, the World Bank tells us, and they're right, the data they're using is correct, that poverty is reducing. What they mean by that is that the percentage of people on less than $1.90 a day across the world and in developing countries or poor countries and across regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, including Sub-Saharan Africa, is decreasing. Poverty is decreasing as a percentage of the population. Okay, they don't mean that the total number of people in poverty is decreasing because it's not. Okay, so that's the first step. Just look at the numbers and be critical of them. Question them. Try to think about what they're telling you. Differentiate between percentages and absolutes. Differentiate between absolute poverty and relative poverty. Differentiate between different kinds of education. Think critically about what it means to have a bunch of logos on a poster. I think there's something there about anti-dogmatism. And on this I'm going back to William Easterly, who also wrote about the white man's version, picking up from Rudyard Kipling. I think there's something about trying to be skeptical of universal truth, but there's something problematic there as well, because we can't do this without values of our own. So we are going to have our own version of what we think is important, and I think we have to be very conscious of that. I think we have to be conscious that in doing that, we're allowing for the fact that we know other people think differently from us, and we're going to work alongside them as far as we can, but we have to also know what our red lines are, to use a popular term in British politics at the moment. There's something there about being non-dualistic, as in, development is not all about polarities. One of the problems with development is that we swing from one extreme to another. We change policy all the time. So governments are all about reducing poverty one day and about education the next, or about opening up markets the next. And one of the problems of that is that you never get time to settle on anything and improve that thing consistently. So they're swinging between fuels, between poles. Another thing that we do as people is we tend to overstate positions. So we tend to say, that's rubbish. And what we should be saying is, actually there's something in that we need to preserve, but something about it that's problematic as well. We also need to see when things are good, that they're never good in I said before, there are no win-win situations. There are always losers in any change. And actually there are losers also in any status quo. So we're not talking win-win situations, we're not seeking win-win situations, we're seeking a much more realistic, critical analysis of situations. I think in some way there's some truth in the idea of pushing more bottom-up, more indigenous, more localized solutions, but that isn't enough by itself either. So I think we should be talking about incremental change. I think we should be talking about valuing history, understanding culture. I said at the beginning of this that I wanted to situate the development discourse in a historical context, and that's why I chose the two readings I gave you, because I think each of them does that. But that's not enough by itself either. I think there's a need for something quite deep and local, and that goes against quite a lot of the practice of development over the last decades, that treats development as something that can be professionalized, where we can be development professionals who go from one country to another, solving problems related to water or sanitation or conflict or governance. And I think that's often quite dangerous and quite damaging. Consequently, I don't think, linked to that, I don't think that there are clear transferable models or templates, although we need to be able to learn from one situation to the next. And the last question was so taking Redcliffe, he raises an interesting question about whether technology might help us solve environmental problems or might take away the ability to find solutions to them by automating processes that are then co-opted by markets that we don't then have control of. So he asks a lot of questions but doesn't resolve them very clearly. So I'm asking there on a wider level, what's the role for technology?